So my name is Tatiana Bolton, and I'm the Policy Director at the R Street Institute for Cybersecurity and Emerging Threats. Here at R Street, we're a nonprofit think tank that focuses on free markets and real solutions. In the cybersecurity group, we work on cybermetrics, secure and competitive market initiative, which focuses on supply chain security, cyber state and local cybersecurity, as well as diversity in cybersecurity. So today we welcome Dan Lips, who's going to be walking us through some of the most fascinating issues in the funding of cybersecurity. He comes to us from the Lincoln Network and many years on the Hill. So thanks for joining us, Dan.
Great to be with you. Thanks for hosting this.
Absolutely, happy to have you. So we are going to talk about the funding and money behind cybersecurity. So this is an event in a series that is focused on the basics of cyber. We've started with offensive cybersecurity, defensive cybersecurity, what agencies work on these topics, who gets what authorities, how they're used, and today we're going to talk about how it's all funded, who gets money, what money, and why. So I'm going to start with a few slides to just walk us through the basics, and then after we sort of talk through some of these beginning slides, we're gonna go back to Dan, and we'll talk about some more in-depth questions and try to put them on the spot, which will be fun. So, all right, next slide, please. So this is a chart of information that sort of encapsulates the amount of money that's spent in the civilian agencies for cybersecurity. So you may think that having seen a lot of different ransomware attacks and massive intrusions to government networks, et cetera, across last 10 years and more, that cybersecurity in the federal government is very well funded. But you would be incorrect. The amount of funding that we have actually within the civilian agencies, so that doesn't include the Department of Defense, is up somewhere in the neighborhood of $6 to $8 billion. Now, that does sound like a lot of money, and in the 22 request for next year, the Biden administration has actually asked for an increase. That increase is approximately 14%. Again, sounds perhaps like a large percentage, but when you take a look across the federal agencies, this is actually a very small portion of the budget. And if you think about cybersecurity as a portion of national security, this is actually a very small chunk of change. Next slide, please. So who actually is involved in the funding and how does it transition? We'll go to Dan about this in a little bit as well. Just like the regular budgeting process within the federal government, cybersecurity goes through the same budget process with various different agencies, which I'll touch on in a minute. The president submits a budget. The Office of Management and Budget, OMB, is a part. Congress provides oversight and technically appropriates and authorizes the funds. And then the executive agencies work with the White House to develop their budgets year after year. And they're the ones who request funding for various projects and efforts for cybersecurity. Next slide, please. So these are some of the agencies that are the main players in cybersecurity. You will find what you would think you would find: Department of Defense and CISA, the DHS Cybersecurity Agency, as two of the main players. But these sort of symbols are not representative of the proportions of money that they get. Department of Defense here is the largest recipient of funding. CISA gets approximately $2 billion a year. Cybercom within DoD gets a lot of money, but other agencies that help to support critical infrastructure protection also get funding, like the Department of Treasury, who helps the financial sector, Department of Energy, that helps the energy sector, and others, including the Department of Transportation. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that we showed at the defensive cybersecurity event, making the point that as a proportion of the overall budget, cybersecurity actually gets a fairly small piece of the pie. DoD's budget, as you can see, to be fair, includes some cybersecurity funding for cybercom, Army, for which Army, Air Force, and others provide money and provide acquisition support. But CISA gets a very, very small percentage of that money, $705 billion to approximately $2 billion. So it's very, very small. Next slide, please. And then what it's spent on varies. A lot of different agencies do a lot of different things. They have different authorities, and all of them request money to accomplish the goals of their particular agency. Cyber Command focuses on offensive cybersecurity, network defense. They have various command and control budgets. They have training dollars. They have things like that. CISA requests funding for cyber incident response, cybersecurity assessments, governance, information sharing, things like that. And the SSAs, the sector-specific agencies, and other agencies like Treasury, Energy, Transportation, Water, all request funds for things like sensor suites, putting sensors out on the networks to gather data and information to protect networks. They also request funding to support their policy shops within their agencies and for interaction with the stakeholders and the corporations, the companies, the state and locals that work with them to protect the sector. So that is sort of the sum of the kind of basics here. And then we're going to go back and sort of talk about how this happens, why this happens, and maybe some of the challenges that we face. So Dan, I think that we can agree that perhaps CISA needs more funding, but exactly, can you talk a little bit more about this blend between or the split between defensive and offensive funding and how that happens?
Sure. Well, I think that zooming out, I think, as you were saying, cybersecurity has been in the news recently with lots of ransomware attacks. But when we're talking about this, it's important to recognize that there's a long history here. Congress has been warned that cybersecurity is a major high-risk area since going back 25 years. GAO first reported that back in the 1990s. So when we get to your snapshot of CISA's funding compared to the overall defense funding, it strikes me that there's an imbalance in the resources that are being invested on cybersecurity broadly. When it comes to CISA's specific budget, I'd be happy to get into that and to some of the questions around should it be funded more, and has CISA's resources been spent well under its history at NPPD and recently. I think that there's a broad recognition that we need to be doing more and we need to be doing better with what we're spending. Happy to talk more about kind of offensive versus defensive cyber if you want to get into that now, or if you want to.
Yeah, well, so why don't we talk about federal cyber spending compared to other areas of the federal budget, right? Such as the traditional defense budget, wasteful spending, things like that. Are we seeing the same sorts of things in cyber that we do across the other federal agencies?
Well, I think that first, I think that the big comparisons that we need to be thinking about are, we've got about 10 billion in federal civilian spending for cybersecurity, and then, as you pointed out, more than 700 billion on traditional defense. As we know from a lot of watchdog reports, a lot of those DoD resources, there's some good questions that could be asked about whether they're being spent wisely. To be candid, I think similar questions could be asked about a lot of the dollars that have been spent on cybersecurity and the current projects that Congress is currently funding. Zooming out beyond DoD's budget, we will look at other areas of the federal government. We know that there's lots of waste. GAO reports that the federal government makes about $75 billion in improper payments every year. Again, about $10 billion more than what we're spending on federal civilian cybersecurity. Programs like the Head Start program, a preschool program, which may or may not be valuable to the folks that it serves, That's about $10 billion. So when we think about the constitutional responsibilities of the federal government, at the top of the list are securing the blessings of liberty and providing for the common defense. And in 2021, protecting the nation's critical infrastructure, at the top of the list, protecting the federal government's own information and secrets. These are pressing national defense issues today. And in my view, I think there's a real imbalance that Congress needs to be looking at.
So why do you think cyber funding hasn't been a priority? We've seen repeated attacks, right? I think in the last year, we've kind of become more alert. The public has become more aware of how cybersecurity or cyber intrusions can affect their daily lives, like Colonial Pipeline and all of that. But I think we're still seeing a bit of hesitancy in terms of putting more money and resources or realigning the risk that we see across those areas of traditional defense and then cybersecurity defense.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think looking beyond the recent year, this has been a problem that national policymakers have been aware of and frankly admiring for the past couple decades. A couple thoughts come to mind on why we haven't seen a significant resource shift towards cybersecurity. The first involves federal IT spending. Something we haven't talked about yet is just in the IT budget alone, there's something on the order of 50 to 60 billion being proposed for IT projects. And I think historically, policymakers have thought about cybersecurity as something that the IT people can figure out. As long as we're investing there, the cybersecurity will follow. And that's clearly not been the case. IT has been a significant management challenge for the federal government for a long time. But when it comes to questions about why we haven't spent it more on, say, CISA and other federal outward-reaching cybersecurity projects, I think there's frankly been some questions about the proper scope of the federal government's activity in cybersecurity. About a decade ago, there was an effort to change the approach of the federal government's role in cybersecurity to be more of a standard setter and regulator, which has caused some concern over the years. There's also questions about the federal government's capabilities. Do we have the right talent? Are the programs that are being implemented being managed effectively? So I think there's some reasonable skepticism on Capitol Hill, but I think that needs to be overcome through education and frankly through better oversight and better management within the agencies.
Yeah, so I think I worked at the DoD, and so I remember how how regimented that process is when you're developing the FYDP, the fiscal year defense plan, and the way that, or the 5-year defense plan, how they plan, how they budget, they think strategically, they think out 5 years. There's none of that at CISA, right? There's none of that in DHS. I think because a lot of these agencies, particularly DHS, which has been only authorized once in 2003 and continues to operate sort of in that under that authorization, hasn't been sort of reimagined, re-envisioned, sort of held to account. I think that contributes to the way in which contributes to their inability so far to mature as an organization. CISA, for example, only does planning for the next 2 years, right? DoD is 5. They do funding. They don't track their execution quite as well as DoD does, right? So in federal budgeting, for the non-budget experts out there, in terms of federal budgeting, you first budget for the money, then you ask for the money, you get the money given to you, you get it put in your bank account, and then you have to track how much money you spend. You either buy resources, you buy personnel, you buy tanks, planes, whatever, but they're tracking execution. It's important to make sure that the money that's coming in is being spent and it's being spent wisely. So I would say part of the issue, right, is that CISA and DHS, other agencies in cyber, aren't as mature as the DoD, and so aren't a well-oiled machine when it comes to that.
Yeah, I totally agree. Something that we saw in the recent House Homeland Security appropriations bill and draft committee report that came out. I think for followers of CISA, they should be encouraged that that there's increased funding in that proposed bill, and also in the committee report, there's some good language about being encouraged by CISA's performance. But there's some questions there saying if we need more reporting and some more details about some of their key acquisitions projects and so forth. So I think that there's some reasonable skepticism, as I'd say, about those project areas. I think there's also questions about CISA's broad mission and whether a single agency should be tasked with those very varying responsibilities. There's a lot on CISA's plate, from cybersecurity to infrastructure security to emergency communications to school safety and chemical facilities. That's a lot for an agency to be tasked with when they're confronting really the number one national security threat.
Yeah, no, they definitely do have a broad remit. So should there be sort of more of a discussion about how federal cybersecurity is funded? I mean, and where should that conversation be? I mean, do you think that Congress is focusing on it sufficiently? I know, so I was a policy director at the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, and at the commission, we recommended that the House and Senate both create sort of streamlined oversight functions for cybersecurity in a House Select and a Permanent Select Committee in the Senate for cybersecurity. I think that would significantly improve oversight and the ability for Congress to help with that. But is that where these conversations should be? Should the White House be pushing more for an understanding of how cyber dollars are spent, where they're going, and how to manage them?
Yeah, I think that those are good ideas. I think for starters, it was encouraging that a few years back the Appropriations Committee required this cyber budget document that's included in the president's annual budget submission. I recently had the chance to testify before a Senate subcommittee and encourage that subcommittee, which is focused on national security threats and federal spending oversight, that would be within their purview, or perhaps the full committee at HISGAC, to conduct a strategic review of the threats that we're facing, the cost of those threats versus what's being invested. But I think that conversation and that type of review could happen in any number of places. I think the ideas put forth by the Solarium Commission regarding streamlining oversight and jurisdiction are very thoughtful and would be an improvement over what is currently happening on the Hill. From my experience, jurisdiction was a significant challenge to address really any cybersecurity issue, since it's touched so many other committees. So I think it could happen in a number of places, but the bottom line is that it should happen. I think Congress should be looking at this and thinking about these long-term costs and long-term threats, and whether we're doing enough.
Yeah. Well, so on that recommendation, you're an expert. You're a policy director over there, right, on his GAC. So I just wanted to ask how likely you think something like that would be to pass. I mean, do you think it would improve oversight?
I think it's unlikely, unfortunately. I think it would improve oversight. The context here is that I used to work at the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, the supposedly authorizing committee of DHS. But DHS, for example, is really the case study in the problem that we're seeing with cybersecurity, since DHS is touched by dozens of committees and almost 100 subcommittees across both of the houses of Congress. And cybersecurity really in the same challenge. It may take some sort of massive cyber event to spur some sort of jurisdictional changes. But even that is really unlikely, as we saw with the history of Homeland Security.
Yeah. So, you were there to walk a novice through the process of how this all works. Who looks at it? How does it go through the process? When the president submits his budget, it's actually not even the first step of the budgeting process.
Yeah, I think on Capitol Hill, largely that's a process that's managed through the Appropriations Committee. Budget submissions come from OMB. My work was as an authorizer, working for an authorizing committee. So we were removed from the budgeting process, but the budget submissions that come from the agencies via OMB and then the White House to Capitol Hill provide valuable insight, both for that critical appropriations process where frankly most of the decisions are made, but it's also a valuable tool for oversight for members of Congress in both chambers to be asking questions and to understand how federal programs are working or not working.
Okay. So is there one area that you think is specifically underfunded?
Well, if we're talking within CISA, I think that there needs to be a greater focus on federal network security. It's a big chunk of CISA's budget, but an area, frankly, where CISA's been struggling. I was encouraged by some of the language that I saw in the House Appropriations Committee report, asking questions about the different technology programs that are used to try and defend federal networks, like the Einstein program or continuous diagnostics and mitigation, CDM. I think that's should be the top priority for CISA moving forward. Let's protect the federal networks and defend the federal government. In terms of overlooked areas, I think that deterrence within the broader cyber federal strategy and budget is overlooked. I think we should be looking more about should there be more resources spent on the FBI and DOJ and other law enforcement agencies to try and confront cyber crime. Yeah, those are a couple.
So we're now talking about sort of federal cybersecurity, but there's also all of the efforts that have to happen in sort of state and local cybersecurity. Talk to us about how all of those also fit into the process.
Well, I think that the part of the mission of the federal government and DHS and CISA, as you know better than I, was a focus on trying to help state and local partners, the private sector, in terms of right now we're facing major challenges for municipal governments, state governments, even school districts in the form of ransomware attacks. There's a big discussion right now on Capitol Hill about whether there should be a new dedicated federal grant program for state and local governments to defend themselves from cyber attacks. My view is that there's already a Homeland Security grant program that could be repurposed for this to help with this challenge. It's important for this whole context of this conversation to recognize that you're really facing unprecedented fiscal challenges with a growing debt burden and unsustainable federal spending. So Congress and others need to make risk-based decisions to prioritize the existing dollars and to use them well. Right now, there's several $1 billion of unspent funds that have been given to states and local governments for Homeland Security over the past 5 years. And those funds could really be helpful right now if they're deployed to address cybersecurity capability gaps and to help protect against ransomware attacks and so forth, given that this is such an immediate threat.
Absolutely. So in your testimony, you mentioned that 5% of the funding is dedicated to cybersecurity, right?
Yeah.
Even if a portion of broader spending on other things like IT. Yeah. And we could, or the Congress could, as one of their functions, change those percentages, right? And a lot more of those grants to cybersecurity spending as opposed to other national defense spending or national protection spending. And so, I think that's a great idea because as the Cyberspace Solarium Commission recommended a new grant program or grants for state and local partners so that they could improve cybersecurity, mostly because, as many of you know, state and local budgets are notoriously low and underfunded and often get used for emergencies or other projects, and they have to stay budget neutral. So they are not spending a lot on cybersecurity. They're just not. You saw the Atlanta hacks, the Baltimore hacks. There's all kinds of problems. And so, talk about your idea there about transferring some of or changing some of those percentages to make it more focused on cyber.
Yeah, I think that would be a really smart thing for Congress to do. when we think about the history of the Homeland Security grant programs, they existed from the 1990s, even before DHS was created, but they really became expanded and large scale after the terrorist attacks of 2001. And the view from Congress at the time was that these programs would be risk-based and intended to help states and urban areas and other partners reduce capability gaps to prevent terrorist attacks and to be able to recover from terrorist attacks. And they were always intended to be risk-based and to change over time. Unfortunately, what we've seen over the past 20 years is that it's really turned into just another subsidy for state and local public safety. I worked on some oversight of those programs, and we saw states using it for routine expenditures, cities using it just to buy vehicles that they didn't seem to have a real tie to preventing terrorism. Today, if we're just spending such a small fraction of those funds on cybersecurity, given that it's such a large threat, it would be common sense to try and increase that level. There's also a lot of money on the table right now that they could put to work today to help address that threat. They don't need to wait for Congress to require more to be spent.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, what do you think is stopping state and locals from using some of the funds that are on the table? I mean, obviously after 9/11, a lot of cities, small towns, right, went out and they bought more firefighting equipment, more, Kevlar vests for their police officers and things like that. But at some point, as the grants and the funding continued, some of those were spent, I would argue, for equipment that was not necessary, like you said, not aimed at the terrorist threat. And so, at this point, now that we're sort of pivoting, I would argue, appropriately to a more the more tangible threat of cybersecurity, we should be focusing on other ways to use those dollars. And so, state and locals were eager to spend that money on all kinds of things physical. What's preventing them from moving in and spending more money to shore up their networks?
It's a good question, and I think I can only speculate. One possibility is that the funding that's been provided to the public safety and homeland security community over the past 20 years has come to be relied upon. So it's hard to take money, say, away from police departments and to invest it in the CISO's office, perhaps. There's some probably local political challenges. There's probably some local governments being slow to adapt to the changing threat environment, which I think national policymakers could help encourage, as we've talked about, by putting a higher floor on what's spent on cybersecurity. I think that there's many reasons for why that could be the case, but it should change.
Yeah. Well, and so talk about a little bit too about the difference here between IT and cyber spending, right? Because I think a lot of people conflate the two, and a lot of people think that, well, I've put money into IT modernization, and therefore I've budgeted for cyber. I know what I'm doing, and I'm modernizing my systems.
Yeah, I think that they're two, but like they're two interconnected, but not the same thing. It's one thing to be upgrading and investing and maintaining acquisitions over IT investments, but it's another thing to be staffing and to be training employees to interact with IT systems in a way that will maintain cybersecurity. Also looking beyond organizations, there's a lot of the cybersecurity funding is supposed to be outward reaching and providing support to partners in the private sector and so forth. So they're connected, but it's not the same thing.
Right. And so you've also talked about sort of the federal rules that we have that produce sort of a compliance burden on state CIOs and CISOs.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about how that affects cyber spending?
Yeah, I think this one's crazy, and that's something that totally should be fixed. Because of the different ways that the federal agencies try and help protect American people's information that's managed by states and different government entities at the state level, there's different rules from, say, the IRS or the Health and Human Services Department, Department of Education, even the FBI. And when you put that all into the desk of a state CIO, who's got a limited team, who's probably struggles to hire people who could earn more money in the private sector, they end up spending so much of their time on compliance. One state CIO testified before Congress a few years ago that simply complying with all the federal paperwork cost his office more than 10,000 hours per year, which accounts to 5 staffers working full-time on compliance. And those are hours and personnel resources that couldn't be spent on securing and upgrading state systems, providing help to municipalities, which are even more under-resourced in many cases than state governments. So simply by organizing and harmonizing the rules, something that the National Association of State CIOs and the National Governors Association have called for, we could improve cybersecurity today at the state and local level without any cost.
Yeah.
Sort of a no-brainer.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. I definitely am a fan of harmonizing rules and doing what we can to get away from cybersecurity as kind of in a compliance mindset, both at the state and local level, but also in private industry.
Sure.
Although I have had conversations with the Department of Treasury where and their cybersecurity office that say, no, we don't have duplicative rules. We've talked to our partners and they, our rules are great and they all are completely helpful. So, you still get some pushback.
Totally. And I think the raising Treasury is a great case point here because from my understanding, the financial services sector is really the best example of an entity that's regulated by a maze of different regulators. And they spend a lot of their time, and frankly, they're well-resourced, so they can comply with it in a way that other organizations can't.
Well, JP Morgan, $660 million a year, right, on cyber.
Totally. But there was a promising effort that I think should be a model for the government that came out of the banking sector that was to create a common framework. They use the analogy of a common application for college. You basically comply with this one standard, and then you've satisfied several different financial regulators. And my understanding is that that's been received pretty well in the regulator community. We really need to be harmonizing these rules to help both government and private sector while maintaining the appropriate regulations that are in place.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The rules and the process for complying with those rules, because the process in the financial sector is definitely more advanced than others. And so take good examples where you can find them. So, one of the things that we focus on is the Bureau of Cyber Statistics and trying to get more cyber metrics to enable better policymaking in cybersecurity. So, what do you think about how statistics and trends and relevant data could be helpful in the policymaking process, and then also trickle out into helping us make decisions on funding for cyber?
I think it would be very valuable to have more data and information to inform the debate. I agree with the recommendations that came out of the Solarium Commission to establish that bureau and to improve reporting about it. I think Congress and federal agencies should be careful when they establish those reporting requirements to make them meaningful and useful. To get back to that compliance and reporting challenges that organizations and CISOs and CIOs face. But more information would be better. And I think steering this conversation of federal funding in the future, it would be helpful to have greater data and greater transparency. A lot of the policymaking has been based on incidents rather than data.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to talk about something that came up in the news recently, which was this canceled JEDI contract. But before we get there, I just wanted to ask, when Congress is looking at funding bills for cybersecurity, what do you think are their top 5 concerns?
Well, I think one is the money going to be well spent? Mentioned this earlier, but in the recent House appropriations language, they for DHS, they're giving them more funding, but they have questions for CISA about specific acquisitions programs like CDM and Einstein. And these are really the main programs that the federal government for civilian networks uses to defend against external threats. And basically Congress via the House Appropriations Committee is saying, hey, we need more information about how you plan to use this money before we give you more. So I think that speaks to a broader question and skepticism from the Hill. Is it going to be spent well? Two, is what we're buying going to actually protect against the emerging threats that we're facing? That same House Appropriations Bill report language has a reporting requirement for the DHS secretary to basically say, how vulnerable are our federal IT systems? Even if we're investing in Einstein, is that going to stop the Chinese government or the Russian government or hackers they align with from breaching those systems? So that's another one. Are we at pacing ourselves against the threat, and can current programs address it? Third is basically, is the federal government capable and does it have the talent it needs? Over the years, there have been many efforts to try and help DHS in particular or other federal agencies attract the talent they need in competing with the private sector or say other jobs in the intelligence community. But that's a continued struggle. A fourth is acquisitions. And I think we'll be talking about this when it comes to JEDI, but one of the biggest challenges that the federal government faces and federal agencies in managing cyber programs is paying for it and dealing with the acquisitions process, which is complex and takes years and is not dynamic compared to the threats and needs of the managers and the federal agencies.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I was about to go into acquisitions, but then you said workforce, and I just have to hop on that one.
Yeah.
Obviously, workforce is a huge issue in terms of cyber security. We have a 460,000 job gap or person gap, and that goes up and down every year. It's gone as high as 550,000 openings in the United States right now. So, do you think that there are ways in which some of the funding can be used to shore up some of those holes? I mean, because, from my perspective, I think that a lot of the funding as it's going out doesn't necessarily focus on the people that are going to be doing that work, right? We look at Einstein, we look at these sensor suites that are going out to different sectors to try and look at our networks. But are we looking at the people that are going to be doing that work? And those people need to be paid for. And to be fair, I think one of the things we should do before we hire more people into the federal government is take a look at the hiring and firing within the federal government, right, to improve that system. But leaving that aside, how do we sort of address this workforce problem?
It's been a problem that Congress and outside experts have talked about for years. There have been probably more than I can count efforts in amendments and legislation that's passed to try and improve cybersecurity workforce and training. There's several items in the current House DHS appropriations language that are trying to expand a civilian cyber corps and to improve retraining for military personnel who are leaving the service to go into cyber positions. It's a long-standing challenge, and I don't think there's a great answer. One thing that I've been surprised to hear over the years was that for a long time, DHS was asking for more money to be able to pay cyber workers more than they could, so they compete with the private sector. But when we actually talked to the hiring managers and even some applicants, it turned out that the real problem was that it took forever for someone to get the distance from the time from a job interview to a job offer to the security clearance process took years. And so it wasn't even a matter of money for many of the people. It was just a matter of timing. So simplifying and streamlining the hiring process, being able to get rid of bad employees is an issue I've heard from many people. It just crushes morale to have workers who aren't fulfilling their capabilities. It's a huge problem. We could probably spend the next hour talking about it. But
I know. Well, I'll invite you back for the next
deal.
Our workforce. No, it's a big issue, and having worked at CISA, I can talk to it directly. Brandon Wales, when he was giving a testimony on the Hill, said that the average time from application to actual hire or feet in the office was 367 days. I mean,
Yeah.
367 days is just ridiculous, right? And no, like, who is going to wait around for a year for a job? You know, a lot of people are applying when they're looking for the next job, right? They're they either have left a position or are interested in leaving a position. They're not going to wait a year. And DHS, CISA included, loses a lot of different fantastic candidates for that process, right? Often they'll have to, often they'll have to give 5 different people offers in order to just get one to come on board. And it's not really an issue of money, right? Like, they have cyber pay at CISA, right? So we're trying to compete with the private sector. In fact, to combat kind of the rumors that exist about the pay within the federal government, the pay, especially within DC, where a lot of the policy jobs are in cybersecurity, at CISA, at DoD, at Treasury, at Energy. A lot of those jobs are very well paying.
Yeah.
They're often 13, 14, 15 positions, which, are paid somewhere between like $110,000 and $160,000 a year. And on top of that, says it gets cyber pay for a lot of their positions, not all. But it's an issue of like not resourcing, I think, some of the basic fundamentals, right? We're putting money into cybersecurity tools, but we're not putting money into hiring cybersecurity, right? Like, not just the actual workforce, but the HR offices that are needed to kind of get all of this, get the process going.
Totally. I think that's a really smart place to invest new resources to shorten that time for hires. I've been encouraged by the work that's happened at CISA to build a brand and a culture in that agency, and I think that it's got a bright future. Being able to quickly attract the patriotic people who do want to work there would be really helpful. Be a great way to improve.
I mean, we need to make it the next NSA or CIA, where they've got candidates lined up and out the door who do wait years to get into those positions. And so, I think that cybersecurity is a very important mission. It's a very cool mission. We can get more people and more diverse people into that agency. I think we definitely need to focus on the diversity. But it's going to take some investment into the right areas to get that done.
What about also freeing CISA of some of its sort of other responsibilities? Should CISA still be managing chemical plant inspectors, measuring fences, and?
I know. Well, we're just getting to all the topics, aren't we, today, Dan?
Sorry, I got to put you on the spot.
So I think that things like the chemical sector regulation and all of those sorts of things that CISA does don't necessarily fit into the new reimagined CISA that Chris Krebs has developed over the last few years, since it has become its own sort of an actual agency within DHS. I also believe, as I've written a piece about this, that CISA should be separated out as its own separate agency, focused on that cybersecurity mission, and allow the rest of those missions that don't fall into that very core, those core competencies of a cyber expert, an incident responder, to stay at DHS. So that they can focus on that mission. I think a lot of people are concerned about separating out the physical security and the cybersecurity missions of CISA. They have both. They have an infrastructure section and a cybersecurity section. But I think that it's very difficult for them right now, even within the agency, to focus on both of those things. I've seen the director, right? I saw Chris Krebs struggle to prioritize all of these things at once. If everything's a priority, then nothing is a priority. And so what happened within CISA in the last few years is that cybersecurity was a priority, right? That's where the money went. That's where the people went. But infrastructure wasn't as well resourced. It wasn't as high a priority. It wasn't, top of the list for the director, right? And perhaps appropriately so. But we do need that to be important. That's still very much important, right? CISA, for example, protects the Super Bowl. It protects, the World Series baseball games. It protects all kinds of different things you wouldn't think that they do. but they're also supposed to be the cybersecurity manager, and they've heavily invested into that side. And so I think they should separate out. They should focus on that mission. And if there's some things that fall away, I think that might be appropriate.
I agree with you.
Yeah. All right. So now we go into the acquisitions question, because with budget, right, always comes the acquisition portion. And so for the lay people out there, right, acquisition is just a fancy word for buying stuff. So when the Congress appropriates money to federal agencies, they send that money over to those agencies. And then the agencies distribute that money across their different departments and subdivisions. And then those sort of segments buy things with it, right? They buy people, they buy tools, they buy support, they pay for contracts, they pay for maintenance support, they pay for all kinds of stuff. And so one of the biggest issues I think that I want to talk to you about is the speed of that acquisition process. Part of the reason I think that the JEDI contract for a big cloud service provider for the federal government, for the DoD, was canceled recently. So talk about perhaps the speed of the process, and then also what happened with that JEDI contract.
Yeah, it's a really good example of how acquisitions management basically derails cybersecurity and operational planning for federal agency heads and managers. Basically, several years ago, DoD announced the JEDI contract, trying to move Department of Defense more of its enterprise onto a cloud service provider using available commercial technologies. They announced this $10 billion project that was going to span about 10 years. This is big business for potential key providers. Over the past 4 years, I guess, there's been several bid challenges. There's been a White House intervening to cancel a contract that had been planned with Amazon. During this time, the program managers are thrown in limbo about the plans for moving DoD's enterprise through this contract. And we get to today, where earlier this month the program's canceled after multiple bid challenges and contests, including going through federal courts. It shows how the contractor community often really drives the process and delays the implementation, which should be swifter if we're really serious about implementing good practices for security and upgrading systems overnight. Yeah, it's only one example of many of challenged acquisitions problems.
So many. So, but the question is, how do you work within the process, right? Especially within the DoD, and I used to work in contracts within the DoD. So, it takes about a year and a half to do a small contract, right? And we're talking within the Navy or the Air Force, where we're doing $80 million, $100 million contract. That's considered small, by the way.
Yeah.
not too big, like trillion. But so even for those $80 million, $100 million contracts, it takes a year and a half of somebody working on that contracting process from the beginning, where you're soliciting the request. Even this is, by the way, even when you're doing sole source, which means you're going directly to one company and saying, hey, Amazon, for example, I want you to give me a cloud service provider. I want you to be my cloud service provider. Even if it's just, the company, what you want, and how much you're going to spend on it. It still takes about a year to get estimates, to get the request out, to notify other companies that you're not going to solicit other bids. And then through, as you mentioned, then you throw in the wrinkles of people being litigious and litigating some of the stuff in court. So this doesn't really fit with a cybersecurity life cycle, which is like 6 months, right? To get from like one new phone to the next new phone. So, how do we fix that?
I mean, I've heard following the cancellation of the JEDI contract, there's been some pretty concerned statements coming out of members of the Armed Services Committees. So I think that there may be some legislation considered to streamline acquisitions processes. I think that's a heavy lift given the players that are involved, but something that needs to be done. The timeline issue you raised, for acquisitions, I think, is also something that needs to be kept in mind when Congress or federal agencies are looking at regulating. There's all these things take so much time, and the world changes in several years, or if not months. So we have to have a much more dynamic policymaking and governance approach to cybersecurity across the board.
Yeah, I agree. Well, then the other thing that I think puts pressure on the process and the decisions for who and what and how to fund cybersecurity is the pressure from Congress and specific congressional members and districts to keep particular projects in those districts, right? Like the Hercules, for example, where they were the Air Force was recommending reducing the number of personnel on the new aircraft to 3 versus 5, and the people and the representative from Ohio, where that plane was built, was concerned about the number of planes that would now be built. And so I think this goes to sort of broader, I think, congressional issues, the way in which our whole system works. But I think it certainly puts pressure on cybersecurity choices when there's big change in the system, when we're moving from it's like a new industrial revolution, right? Like we're in a new digital revolution. We're moving from traditional warfare more to a space where we have more cyber warfare. How does that reflect in Congress, and how difficult is it to make some of those big changes?
I think that it's a huge challenge, and I think that many members of Congress are thinking 2 years out. They're not thinking 10 to 20 years out. It's important for this issue in particular that there be a long view to consider how technology is changing, how the nature of conflict is changing. As you mentioned, we're going to be seeing more and more conflict occurring in the cyber domain, and perhaps hopefully less so in the physical domain. We need to be considering how resources should be rebalanced, and we should be very mindful of not falling into the trap of having these decisions be driven by parochial interests based on geography, or frankly by the contractor community and the interests of those who've been receiving defense funds for quite some time.
Are you a believer in Eisenhower's sort of the warnings on the industrial complex? And
I mean, it seems like it, right?
I feel like we've gotten there.
We've certainly gotten there. And if President Eisenhower were around, I think that type of view about what are the immediate threats to clear national security priorities, I think there'd be a focus on what's happening here at home. We're seeing school districts knocked offline for days due to cyber threats. Municipal governments are shut down. Hospitals are endangered. The threat is here. It's not necessarily beyond our oceans anymore.
Yeah, well, that's the issue with cyber threats, right? That it's not, we aren't protected by those oceans that we were against physical attacks, right? Or attacks by planes and ships where we could see it coming. In the cyber domain, we're very much vulnerable, just like any other country. And even though we arguably, I think this is true, we spend the most in terms of cybersecurity of any country in the world. But we are also the most vulnerable, given that we are the biggest power and we have the most critical infrastructure to protect. Israel, for example, is excellent in cybersecurity, and the UK is as well. But they are protecting, in Israel, one airport, one main electrical generating station, one dam, not hundreds. And so, for our sectors, it's going to take a lot of thinking in terms of how to structure or think about the risk appropriately, and how to fix those issues and the funding and the resources necessary, and to realign those appropriately.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's a big challenge, but it's something that's worthwhile for Congress to take on.
All right. Well, so in our, as we wrap up here in the last few minutes, do you have any sort of long-term suggestions for what we should do right now?
Well, I think for those who, I know some of our audience, there's congressional staff. I think that there's great work that can be done through oversight and trying to learn more about these federal programs, and whether they're, how they're working and what needs to be resourced better. I would really like to see, as I mentioned, Congress conduct a strategic review of what the threats are and what needs to be funded. And perhaps that could come externally, but it would be terrific if it happened on Capitol Hill. I think that more needs to be thought about the appropriations process, and those should be encouraged to increase funding for the programs that are being operated well. But within the administration and federal agencies, it's critical that there be some greater transparency and, frankly, better management of some of these programs to inspire confidence. It's been a challenge for many federal agencies in the past that has led to Congress not trusting it with these responsibilities. So there's work to be done across the board, but I think some great work could come out of it.
I agree. Well, and I will agree with you there. And I think that generally we need to think strategically. As you said, we need to do that review, and the administration needs to do that review more broadly across all of the agencies. Take a look at how we're funding, in a broad sense, defense and cybersecurity, because cybersecurity is continuously thought of as separate from defense. But I keep arguing that cybersecurity is a component of national security, and it must be treated as such, and it must be considered as a portion of our defense spending. And so it shouldn't be, while it's not within the Department of Defense, it still absolutely defends our networks and our national security. And so we need to reconsider where the risks lie and who is getting funded right now at what levels. So while I, agree with Dan that perhaps we need to take a look at CISA's authorities and the mission set that they have, and perhaps take a look at the efficiencies that can be gleaned from working on some of that funding, I think broadly speaking, that $700 billion to $2 billion number is completely out of whack. We've got a lot of money going to offense. We've got almost nothing going to defense, and we live in, as some have said, in the glassiest of houses. We have a lot of attack surfaces, and so we need to think about that when we legislate, when we write policy, when we write strategy. So thank you all so much for coming here today and taking a look with us at budgeting. Dan, thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure to have you, and we hope to have more meetings in the future.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much, everyone.